So this is the third time I'm filming this video. So, I don't know. We'll see how this one goes. Welcome back to another video in what I hope will be a series of origin stories. I'm your host, Stuart, but you can call me Santov. For today's video, we will be discussing the tattoo shirt. It has been around for ages, but for some reason people gravitate more, or people tend to gravitate more towards it recently. I thought it would be appropriate to make a video about this item for today's video. So let's dive in. I think most people who are aware of these tattoo shirts know somewhat what they are, but in case some of you don't, a quick rundown. They are a slim-fitting sheer material, either nude colored or not, to sort of resemble a second skin with graphics on them that resemble tattoos. Having said that, there is a tendency to describe a lot of similar items as tattoo shirts, which not necessarily don body ink like graphics, but I'll talk about that later on in this video. Now that we have that out of the way, let's begin with the history, the origin story of the tattoo shirt. Obviously, it started with Jean-Paul Gaultier, right? In fact, it didn't. Back in the 70s, Issey Miyake created a tattooed bodysuit with a very iconic Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin print, inspired by the traditional Japanese style of tattooing, something that you would see on members of Yakuza as well, because it would mainly be present on the back and not in any visible areas of the body. And this was years or even decades before all over tattooing in mainstream popularity became a thing, or became part of the zeitgeist, if you will, which just kind of shows the brilliance of Issey Miyake. So now we got that little caveat out of the way. We then arrive at Jean-Paul Gaultier, right? No, we don't. We actually arrive at someone that Jean-Paul Gaultier is very familiar with, and vice versa. And it is Martin Margiela. And I'm talking about his iconic 89 debut collection, which featured a trompe-l'œil shirt, which means optical illusion in French. So it meant to create the illusion of body ink on the models who wore the items. And it featured tribal prints on nude sheer material, as I mentioned earlier, to create this optical illusion of a tattoo. Now, obviously, what has to be noted is that Margiela was mentored and inspired by Jean-Paul Gaultier. So perhaps there is some overlap between the ideas of both designers, but the timeline suggests that Margiela was the first to introduce it in Western fashion. Now, Margiela might have introduced the tattoo shirt to the public, but Jean-Paul Gaultier took it to a whole nother level. Now, of course, Jean-Paul Gaultier has many iconic shows, but the one that is relevant for today's video is obviously the Spring-Summer 94 collection, which was named Les Tatouages, meaning the tattoos in French. And the collection showed body ink from various kinds of cultures, and it was sort of the epitome of tattoo in fashion. The aesthetic of punk meets tribal is what kind of defined Jean-Paul Gaultier and his collections in years after. and can be seen, maybe not in its entirety, but definitely in some aspects of many of his collections. Now, what is interesting was that basically the entire show was a trompe-l'oeil, or an optical illusion. Models were donning tops, dresses, skirts, whatever, with the tattoo print, with the tattoo design, as well as wearing fake piercings. So all of it was basically an homage, or a reference to body manipulation of all kinds, and the relevance of body manipulation and body ink in different cultures, which was very interesting, and it's an amazing collection just to check out in its entirety if you haven't. Now, the tattoo shirt went on to be implemented in many of Jean-Paul's collections, which is also why this item is so closely associated with Jean-Paul Gaultier, and for good reason, I suppose. But it was not only Jean-Paul who implemented this design, or this style of clothing in his collections, especially in the late 90s. But also Undercover, who for their Spring Summer 98 collection released body ink items, as well as Issey Miyake, who also for their Spring Summer 98 collection released the Cyber long sleeve top, which in terms of graphic design was not necessarily reminiscent of body ink, but the construction of the item, of the top, slim fitting, sheer materials to create a sort of second skin, is what is reminiscent of the tattoo shirts, and is part of the reason that I kind of put this in this video as well, because people tend to associate not just the graphic design of tattoos, but more the nature of a second skin to create this optical illusion as a tattoo shirt. So for that reason, I put Issey Miyake in this video as well. But the design was way more abstract, and it was an all-over print, not necessarily showcasing any skin. Now we move a few years ahead in time, and I want to talk about Spring Summer 07, where Jean-Paul Gaultier once again revisited the body ink, but this time it was reminiscent of the original Issey Miyake bodysuit, in terms of a lot more Japanese style of tattooing was showcased. And what was so interesting about this collection was the dichotomy of the two worlds that were meeting in this collection. On one hand, you had the very rough and raw culture of tattooing, and on the other hand, you had a very delicate and sophisticated and elegant culture of high fashion and haute couture gowns and dresses. And the fusion, the combining of the two worlds was very interesting, and it's probably one of my favorite versions of the whole tattoo shirt body ink trend that I've come across. Now, not only Jean-Paul Gaultier, but also Margiela revisited his old design from the 89 collection, which they reissued for the H&M collab in 2012, releasing a new version of the item, or another version of the item. And although I appreciate the idea of highlighting such a key piece from such a iconic collection, I do think it kind of takes away from the mystique and from the status of the original item. But that is neither here nor there. What I do believe is that it kind of allowed for this style of garments to be more widespread and to be more known to the mainstream public, which is why more mainstream fashion brands such as D Squared would also end up implementing such a tattoo shirt in their collection, which they did for fall winter 15. And this one was very reminiscent of the Jean-Paul Gaultier shirts, not necessarily the Margiela tops, but I do think it is a half-assed, a bit of a cheap version of what Jean-Paul tried to do, and it is not necessarily celebrating body ink, but merely jumping on this aesthetic of fake tattoos. Besides the adaptation of body ink in fashion in the western part of the world in the 21st century, we also see another designer try their hands on it, none other than Comme des Garçons, Kubo. And what is interesting about her work was that she collaborated with a tattoo artist. I think it was called JK5 or JK8, I think JK5, and they collaborated on their fall winter collection, their fall winter 15 collection for Comme des Garçons Homme Plus, which also saw arm sleeves, leg sleeves, tops, bodysuits, all with new and interesting graphic design, body ink design, which was a lot more thought out and a lot more original than perhaps the squared version of the trend. And then once again they implemented this aesthetic for their recent women's collection for spring summer 19 for mainline Comme des Garçons. It was a bit safer and simpler, and therefore it also wasn't very thought out in my opinion, and it isn't necessarily one of my favorites. I think the fall winter 15 iteration was a lot better and a lot more original, but I don't necessarily know the story behind the spring summer 19 collection, so perhaps I'm missing something. And then lastly for this video, we have the one that people are probably most familiar with and that you will probably already know, and that is obviously Vetements. And Vetements paid homage to Margiela once again. It's up for debate whether or not they reference Margiela or they just straight up copy Margiela. I also mentioned it in the last origin stories because there is a trend of Vetements copying Margiela, so who knows. But yeah, they reference his iconic work from the 89 collection by using a very similar nude looking sheer top with black design, but instead of tribal design it has the Russian style of tattooing. And perhaps Vetements was mostly responsible for this renewed resurgence, this renewed interest in tattoo shirts, in this renewed interest in trompe-l'oeil design and body ink items. Because I haven't seen many people wear the Comme des Garçons pieces, for example, but the Vetements pieces are everywhere. What I do appreciate is that it has highlighted the work of Jean-Paul Gaultier a bit more, which is about time. I think he was very underrated for a very long time, and it's good to see he got his just due. Like many other designers, I think there's much more to his work than just the tattoo shirts, and that is kind of what people tend to associate with Jean-Paul Gaultier as of right now. But I hope they dive a bit deeper into what he's done for fashion. Now what I do wonder is, what is the appeal of these tops? Like, what is the reason you might like it? I'm not a big fan of it myself. My personal preference would probably lean more towards the Issey Miyake Cyber long sleeve top because of its abstract design, because of its abstract graphics, and they do not necessarily scream fake tattoo, if you know what I mean. But of course, to each his own. What I do kind of fear is that people tend to wear them just because of the aesthetic. I do think the resurgence of the Jean-Paul Gaultier tattoo shirts, it does take away from the original idea behind the tattoo shirts, the idea of showcasing or celebrating different cultures through their body ink, and it has become more of a gimmicky item, which is kind of sad because there's a lot more that went into his 94 collection, for example, that it just happens to be a item you can wear for an interesting Instagram picture, whatever. That is pretty much all of the designers that I recall, or that I could find who implemented such a design. I probably missed a few, so if I did and you know which ones, please let me know in the comments and educate us all. I'm trying to get a few more pieces that I can do such a origin stories about, because I'd like this to be a continuing series on this channel. I'll do some more research and see what else we can find. For now, thanks for watching, and as always, deuces. See you next time.